Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career success in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and happy to give you actionable ideas to elevate your current or perhaps your future nonprofit organization. Thanks for listening. If you're a current nonprofit leader, or maybe you hope to be one, you're in the right place. I'm glad to bring you these weekly conversations with nonprofit experts who are really on the cutting edge of our sector. And if you would do me a favor, share this episode with one other person so that we can continue to build a global community focused on nonprofit leadership. I think this is an episode you will want to share because I had a fantastic conversation with Cheryl Williams, who brings nearly 3 decades of nonprofit and for-profit experience, especially in the area of marketing and communications. Cheryl is the CEO of the consulting firm Hudgins Williams Associates, and she's worked with organizations all over the world from her home base in Baltimore, Maryland. As a nonprofit leader, you know all too well the added layer of complexity the word hybrid has brought to your organization. Everything is both live and virtual or some combination, and it's affecting your programming, your fundraising, and certainly your marketing communication efforts to all of the critical stakeholders that your nonprofit is trying to communicate with. Well, Cheryl's got some great and actionable advice. In fact, she's got a 4-step framework that is a fantastic way to both assess and improve your nonprofit's marketing communication efforts. And it's critical in the noise that exists in so many channels of social media and website and print and every other form you're trying to reach these critical stakeholders. Well worth paying attention here. Now, don't forget to check out the show notes. This is episode number 123. Just go to the podcast or the news page at pattonmcdowell.com, and you'll find out all about the resources that Cheryl and I discussed, as well as more information on the great work she's doing at Hudgins Williams Associates. Speaking of resources, while you're on our website, make sure you connect with us. We're on all of the social media platforms, in particular LinkedIn. Make sure you're on our email list as well. You can find that opportunity on the bottom of the homepage. In fact, you can even schedule a no-obligation 15-minute call. Let us learn more about the great work you're doing and maybe ways we can help you. Strategic planning, board engagement, fundraising, or maybe you and I can discuss your next step on the path to nonprofit leadership. We've got coaching, training, and a unique mastermind program that may be of interest. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Cheryl Williams. Cheryl, thank you for joining me on the path.
You are welcome, Patton. It's a privilege to be here with you today.
I'm excited about this conversation because you bring such great expertise from your corporate experience that you've now brought to the nonprofit sector. And I know it'll help our listeners who know they need to be more effective in marketing communications, but maybe they aren't sure where to start. When you think about the nonprofit leaders you work with, what do you see as the greatest challenge?
Well, of course, I can't narrow it down just to one, but I can narrow it down to 3. The most obvious is how much clutter, noise, and information exists. And now, over the past year, we've had more time to absorb it. So your nonprofit's message and mission is critical to you and your stakeholders, but it's fair to say competition for people's attention has never been greater. The second, less obvious one, is that marketing is difficult to prioritize for investment, not because it's not important, but because so many things are more important. So ensuring that as a nonprofit leader, that you see marketing as a critical foundational investment to gain the support you need for more direct and visible efforts is critical. And finally, the third is that marketing looks so easy. Need more eyeballs? Just make a viral video, get on social media. Everybody thinks they can do it. And so often a lack of understanding and appreciation of marketing as both an art, but also at its best, a data-based science is key.
So well put. And you are absolutely right. It's easier said than done. And I'm sure as you've gotten into the trenches with nonprofit leaders, you've helped them unpack those three kind of challenges you just articulated. I assume, Cheryl, is that part of the reason you got into this nonprofit work and consulting? Obviously, you had a successful corporate career with Procter and Gamble, but why did you get into the consulting work you do now?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, right now I actually have three lines of business. I do strategic planning for associations through an affiliation with Tecker International. I do coaching, which is my passion, because every conversation leads a client to defining and achieving peak professional performance. Say that 5 times fast. I often do. And then the third one that we're focusing on today is around marketing communications, which, as you mentioned, I was blessed to enjoy practicing with Procter and Gamble, but also with a humanitarian nonprofit in countries ranging from Nicaragua and Niger to Singapore. But to answer your question, after 20 years with P&G and seeing how corporate approaches can result in breakthrough support and success for nonprofits, it really made sense that this would be my primary line of business.
Well, I love how you put that, and the fact that breakthrough is part literally of the title of this episode. As we think about breakthrough opportunities with marketing communications, often our friends, Cheryl, in the nonprofit community are just juggling a lot. And I'm curious, how do you manage all of the volume of activity? Speaking of the different things you are working on literally right now, what advice do you offer folks looking to be more productive and organized, which is certainly the case for nonprofit leaders?
Well, this year, Pat, and I've really begun to prioritize self-care for myself and for my coaching clients. And now I begin most days with devotions, only about 20 to 30 minutes of national news. I try not to go down the rabbit hole. And ideally, at least 30 minutes of exercise, which gets my head clear and my heart right for the day. It's not always easy, and except for Sundays, client needs come first, but I have noticed a difference in what I've been able to focus on and accomplish and as a result. And the second one is actually a practical tool I swear by, to the degree that I've asked for a referral incentive for this product, but they won't give me one. And it's my e-notebook, which is called Remarkable. It can be found at remarkable.com. I'm old school, Pat, and I write things down.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
and
indeed.
this is an electronic thing. It's not even a tablet that organizes my notes, professional and personal. And remarkably, see what I did there?
Yes,
and
well
most
done.
importantly, it converts my handwriting to text that I can put in Word documents and then organize. So it keeps stuff in the cloud as it is, or as a converted Word document. And what it does that really makes it special is what it doesn't do. That's all it does. It's not a tablet.
Wow.
There aren't apps. There aren't other beeping things. I'm a bit of a Luddite, but I was a very early adopter of this technology, and they keep adding features that make it even better.
That's such a great combination of, like you, the handwritten nature of note taking, I think, is just fundamental. And we can't totally give that up despite the technological advantages that we have afforded to us. I don't see why you aren't a spokesperson for them right now, Cheryl, because you did a great endorsement. But the point is, we've got a lot of content in our worlds as nonprofit leaders, and we need to capture it. And clearly, that's what you've been able to do.
Thank you.
All right, let's dive in. The topic of our episode, of course, there are 4 steps, in your opinion, to breakthrough nonprofit marketing. Let's start with that, Cheryl. What are the 4 breakthrough elements? And then we can unpack each one of them.
Perfect. They are why, who, what, and how. Okay, we're done.
That was easy. We can put that into a soundbite very quickly, can't we? But I bet there is complexity in those 4 elements. The questions or the terms are clear, but why don't you walk us through that and why those 4 elements are so important?
Absolutely. So, as I kind of referred to earlier, everybody wants to jump to how: make a viral video, issue a press release, do more social media. But that's actually the how is the last step in the process, Patton. The first step is why, which for mission-based nonprofits is a little easier for corporations whose primary why, let's face it, is primarily profit.
Right.
So for nonprofits, you're kind of ahead of the game on the why of it. The next is who. You are likely to have dozens of stakeholders as a nonprofit and as a nonprofit leader, but the true understanding of their segmentation and their wants, needs, and desires And the other challenging part, prioritizing among them, is a critical foundational step. So those are the first two, why and who. Should
That's
I go on to what,
fantastic.
or any
Well,
follow-up on those first? Or?
yeah, I want to ask you about why, because I thought that that's such an important element, certainly as I think about nonprofit fundraising, how you articulate your case for support. The why, Cheryl, it sounds like is part of that and tied directly to it. In fact, what is our nonprofit trying to accomplish? But more importantly, why? Do you find nonprofits have that clarity within their strategic plans? Or is that part of the thing you see early on where they don't necessarily understand or articulate their why very well?
Patton, what you said that's key is articulate it. So it's understandable to you who are on the inside and live it and breathe it every day. But it is amazing how often those why statements, those mission statements, one, aren't communicated or understood consistently across all of your internal stakeholders, your board, your senior staff. If you ask someone what your nonprofit does, you'd be amazed, or how many different answers you get. So
Right.
it's really key that your why is externally focused on your how your who will perceive it, that it's engaging, that it's compelling, that it's concise, that it's conversational, so that it can be communicated consistently by folks who know and care the most to others who, again, are hearing of thousands of different messages every other minute.
No, so well put. And I'm struck by the kind of distinction you make for the who, because I think my first answer might be, okay, well, it's on my website. I want the world to know about us. But it sounds like you want us to be more intentional and I guess differentiate the different types of constituents that we need to communicate with.
Absolutely. You may have members, you may have, well, you will have beneficiaries, you will have donors, you will have so many other types. You have people who aren't yet engaged, and all of those have significant subsegments. So among your donors, you have major donors, you have lapsed donors. Among people who might want to engage, you can separate them psychographically, demographically. There are just so many different ways, and understanding an intimate understanding of those different subsegments and prioritizing. And you don't necessarily prioritize to eliminate anyone. That's something, a point that I really want to make sure folks understand.
Right.
It's to help make sure that the folks who are most likely to benefit from or support your organization are hearing what they need to hear.
Well, Cheryl, back to the why. I know you want us to be more clear and consistent as we articulate our why, but do we adapt that message to some extent to the who? These different audiences you describe, how would you describe the variation, if any?
That's a great question, Pat, and it leads to the third step, the what. What is all about messaging? So yes, as a nonprofit, you know your mission and you can articulate it across different audiences, but you need to make sure that it is specific to those subsegments. Exactly what you said, a corporate donor is going to need to hear something very different than a first-time donor or a potential board member or the general public. So understanding what the core statement is that everyone needs to hear, but then also figuring out what needs to be, what will be compelling for other audiences is a critical third step.
No, that's so well put. And I can see now, I'm tracking with you how you've got a very cool design. You know, if we articulate very well the why, we think specifically about the different who audiences, and now we're getting into what they need to hear. And I suppose, Cheryl, that takes us right to the how, because I guess depending on the audience and the message, that will help us determine literally how to deliver it.
Exactly. So if your primary target, and it often is major corporate or institutional donors, you know what? Viral videos on TikTok may or may not be the best way to reach them.
Good
It may
point.
be through a conversation. I'm working with a client right now who's actually going to leverage their corporate institutional partners to get into their newsletters so that they're reaching their employees. So it's something that we wouldn't have thought of if we hadn't really focused on the who and the what for that audience.
Now, I've had that conversation, show with a lot of nonprofit leaders, or maybe it's part of a board retreat or staff retreat, and they jump exactly like you said to the what? Hey, let's redo our fancy newsletter or a magazine or some tactical activity. And I pose the question, all right, but who are your critical stakeholder audiences? Are they going to read that magazine? Now, I made the joke kind of locally with a famous philanthropist, and I was just like, you know what? He's not going to read this. You've got to
That's right.
think about the how, because
That's right.
maybe, how Cheryl might be, we need to get someone, a peer of his, to sit with him one on one. Maybe that's the best way to deliver the message.
Exactly, exactly. And it seems as though in the world that there's an infinite number of ways to do how. And there are, but there's only a certain number of categories. There's paid advertising, whether it's old school print or broadcast or social media. There's paid. There's earned, like PR, media relations, that can get you across those outlets. And there's word of mouth, and then there's ambassadorship, which is a type of word of mouth. So there's only certain numbers of categories, and you need to get clear on which category makes the most sense for your audience, what resources you have, because we're all working from a standpoint of needing to be efficient with both time and money, and making sure that you are looking among those tools to connect your what to your who.
Uh, that's so well put. And I guess I may know the answer to this question, but you're starting with the who in this sequence. I'm thinking about who literally are we trying to deliver the message, and how is the best way to get to them? Because, Cheryl, the pressure on a lot of nonprofit leaders is they have board members or staff or others saying, well, you better ramp up your Facebook or your Instagram or your TikTok or whatever. And is that how you respond? Because they feel a pressure, I believe, to keep up with the latest, greatest social media tools. How do you respond to that kind of question?
So you had mentioned earlier the importance of being on top of your strategic plan. And just as a side note, if your strategic plan was developed before March 20th of March 2020, then you need to take a look at it and perhaps throw it out, or at minimum refresh it. But say that your strategic plan is fresh, it should give you some highlights and some insights into your why, into your who, into your what. And as you look at it, you made the point earlier, Patton, going and doing, and I don't mean to pick on social media. It
Right, right.
absolutely has a place in every plan. So I'm picking on it because it's kind of the hot thing to do right now. And it's the bright and shiny object, it's the squirrel. And it may have a role in your audience, but it may not. Your local newspaper or a specific blogger might make more sense in order for you to make that connection.
But I think that's what makes your framework so effective, because if they follow the questions in your 4 breakthrough kind of strategies, the answer to the tactical, I think, naturally evolves. If they're clear on who they're going after and they give some thought to what is the best way to deliver the message, maybe that helps them answer the question directly. And you can say, all right, if TikTok is popular amongst your key constituencies, then yes, let's talk about a strategy to do so.
Exactly, exactly. And we didn't spend a lot of time on what, but it's not just that core statement that applies to everybody. There's a lot to that. In fact, that's kind of one of the deepest parts and one of the most traditional parts of this exercise is looking at the core statement that you want everybody to hear. The elevator statement is another way to think about that.
Right.
What are the other categories of information that you want to get across? What are your products and services, and what are the key points that need to be concisely, clearly, consistently communicated and engagingly communicated about those? And very importantly, what questions do you hope not to get asked? Whether they're skeletons in your closet, or it may not even be something like that. It might be something less challenging, but something that can be a distraction from what you're trying to communicate. You want to think about that up front. Which of your who's might ask that question? What will they be hoping to hear, or what will they need to hear to address their discomfort? Because even if they don't ask that question, it could be on their minds and a barrier. And once you think about those, then you could be proactive in addressing those up front, thinking about, well, if you're worried about an issue we had last year, here's what we've done about that, or along those lines, a way of being proactive with the messaging and controlling what you want people to hear and what you know they might be thinking.
That's so valuable. And I'm thinking in terms, Cheryl, almost like an FAQ sheet. So if I'm helping my staff and or board as ambassadors, you described it, yeah, they may get pounced on by a question. What about that person that left suddenly a year ago? There's always turnover. So personnel matters that may become somewhat public, or maybe you were in financial distress recently. So it sounds like, Cheryl, you want to prepare all of the ambassadors of the organization with an appropriate response.
Absolutely. And the format that we used, and I'm sorry, talk about P&G a lot, but it was really an excellent education that I got there. We used a visual format called a message track that kind of categorizes each of the areas that you'll want to talk about. So something like the example you gave of someone who left suddenly,
Right.
You may want to talk about that proactively under the category of leadership. We've had some leadership transition last year, but here's what we're doing now to really have built a strong leadership team, to use that example. And that visual format often works better than an FAQ, because if you're trying to reference an FAQ sheet and you've got 20 pages of cues, you can never get to exactly where you need to be when you need to be there. This visual format in one page, again, just a format that we like to use, allows you to see all of that up front so that you can control the narrative, put that out there up front, and it helps you bridge back in a how. So the how is a media interview. You'll have those key messages right in front, and you can bridge back any question to one of those core messages that you want to communicate.
I was going to ask you exactly that, because I've sensed you are really good at kind of explaining this 4-step process. And I wondered how you presented it graphically. So you're saying in terms of some of the key questions that might come up, there's a 1-page graphic that literally helps all of your key constituents understand how to frame the topic. And does that apply even at a larger scale to some of the other who, what, and how type questions?
Absolutely. It focuses primarily on the what, so there can be a supplementary document. And by the time we get to this one pager, you've spent so much time on the why and the who that you can kind of rattle it off like that.
Yes.
But the visual document that represents the what has the core statement in the middle, and then it has 3 to 4 boxes. So one might be how you can help, how you can get involved. A box might be our flagship products or services. If you have a specific activity or event, a 20th anniversary, there might be a box dedicated to that. There should typically be one that includes your results, what makes you special, what you've accomplished, because everybody will want to know that about you. So you have that in front of you. It's not something that you would use as a handout, although that language typically does make it into all of your materials. I have one client now, actually a former client, the Walters Art Museum, and I'm listening on NPR, and I still hear some of the language that we developed when we worked together years ago, because it does help consistently, concisely, engagingly communicate kind of the core messages that they want to deliver to their audiences.
That's so good. And as an ambassador for your organization, you've helped me be confident and able to be proactive, so I don't get blindsided. Almost regardless of the question, I will have an appropriate response, as you said, turning a transition challenge into a leadership statement. And then I can quickly move toward one of those 4 boxes you just described. And let me tell you about what we're accomplishing. Let me tell you what we did last year. And to me, that would help everyone, particularly volunteers.
I'm glad you said that, Pat, because one of the hows is preparation and training. So almost every communications plan that I work with a client on includes ambassadorship training. And the ambassadors can be board members, they can be staff, they can be committee or task force members. And we train them how to use this tool so that they are, if they're at a social event, or if they're doing a formal interview or at a professional networking event, they've gotten this information in their heads. Now, for a media interview, we do separate training and really work with folks because that is more of a high stakes sort of opportunity. So we practice using the tool in a way that helps folks get back to bridging back, I think is the expression you used. It's one we use as well, to the message you want to deliver, regardless of the question that you're asked. Oops, gave away that trick.
Right. Well, and do you literally, Cheryl, role play it? How do you find it when you do those kind of trainings? I'm guessing you literally help both staff and board or volunteers engage in a conversation that might literally happen to them in public.
Absolutely, particularly for media interviews, but for ambassadorship training as well. There's always an element of practice and role playing. It's like, I know this is so old. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? But you practice,
Right.
you practice, you practice. And specifically, I work the most on practicing how to deal with the questions that you hope you don't get asked. But it may surprise you how often folks flub the softball. Is there anything else you want to say? Or what are your 3 key points? Or what's your core messaging? So we start with the easiest and we work on the hardest. And then the stuff in between, we practice as well.
I'm glad you say that, because I think a lot of times we as nonprofit leaders miss those opportunities when the question is like, yeah, tell me what's going on, or give me some examples of the good work you're doing. And if we're not ready, what a missed opportunity that is. And again, back to your example of the different boxes, you're going to give everybody on these teams at least 3 or 4 good things they could share in an instance like that.
And the boxes are categories. So among those, there'll be several subpoints. So if you have 4 flagship programs, there'll be a quick, concise statement about each. Or if there's statistics that are important to you to rattle off. I always wanted to include stories too. So we haven't really talked about the importance of storytelling, which is leveraging the what in a way that creates a way for folks to really engage. So one of my clients was Meals on Wheels, and I've never, other than working with them as a consultant, I didn't have experience with Meals on Wheels. I hadn't benefited from it, but the story they told that I still tell today is about how someone delivering a meal to a regular client went in and saw that the client didn't just look quite right or look the same and ended up saving their life.
Wow.
That's a story that is so compelling that I tell all the time that I can be an ambassador for, even though it's not something that I experienced. So these stories are a key part of the what and the how that make it engaging and connecting to. That one actually works for just about any audience, but there may be a story that's particularly compelling to a corporate donor or to someone who has been a part of or benefited from or could potentially benefit from the services or products that your nonprofit offers.
Such a good point. And every nonprofit leader listening should think about not just the data, the transactions, if you will, of delivering meals in your example, but the power behind the story. Because you're right, sometimes we can get lost in the data, and it's clear you still remember that story, however many years ago your work with Meals on Wheels was. But can every nonprofit leader listening articulate specific stories that lift up, the power of the data, which I admit is important too?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a both and. It's not an either or. You have the data because your audience, when you speak to someone, you don't know whether they're perhaps more left-brained or right-brained. You don't know which one they'll react to. So a lot of communication, as we all know, is about listening, asking more questions than you answer. But this is being prepared with the answers, whether it's data or story or a combination of both, that really connects with the person in front of you.
I'm struck by the 4 elements of the 4 steps to your breakthrough marketing model. I suppose when you see an organization, that would be the first thing they could almost self-assess. Can they answer the why, who, what, and how questions? But what are you looking for, Cheryl, when you first work with a nonprofit in terms of what's a good marketing plan? How do you tell they've got it all together? Or maybe what are some of the pitfalls you've seen when they don't?
Well, You're right. It really does come down to these kind of core why statements. If I ask you, what does your nonprofit do? Do you use jargon? And not even necessarily when I ask you, but when I ask someone around you. Intimate understanding and an ongoing relationship with your prioritized key audiences, a messaging strategy that connects your who to your why, and a plan that leverages all your available resources to deliver these messages. Staff and board ambassadorship is something I am a real evangelist for. It's incredibly efficient and widely underutilized and should be a component of any nonprofit Marcom plan. And Patton, if there's just one thing I can add about how you do this, one thing that I haven't talked a lot about is research. So one interesting thing that coaching has in common with developing a strong marketing and communications plan is that it's not just about what you're saying and what you're giving, it's what you learn from your audience. If you're doing those things well, there's a big component of research. So I don't know that I've ever done a Marcom plan that didn't involve spending significant time, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, to once we've identified those key stakeholders, or even as part of identifying them and making sure that we understand who they are and the ones we might not have thought of, is a research program to make sure that we are talking to a broad variety of stakeholders, potential stakeholders, lapsed stakeholders, to really help us develop and to think about what we might not miss when we're a part of it every day.
Cheryl, do you recommend, I guess, working with you, or even if we're just doing this on our own? So it's constant communication through surveys or interviews or focus groups, or what do you recommend as some of the methods to make sure, I guess, we're in touch with those key constituencies?
Yes. So when you're
All of the
starting
above.
out, all of the above, when you're doing this at the beginning, you want to use a variety of tools. So you identify who might be responsive. I worked with the State Theater of Maryland, Baltimore Center Stage, and we did focus groups with members. And the cool thing about that is just by virtue of them coming in and spending time with us, it made them feel more connected to us, and they became ambassadors and evangelists moving forward. But there's an efficiency aspect to this too. So by doing a Survey Monkey or whatever product you use, that's who I use, but whatever product you use, and having that as an ongoing, first you want to do it as a baseline, but then ongoing. A lot of my clients now attach an ongoing survey to their communications so that they are continuing to maintain that relationship in here. And you see that now actually for a lot of things when you finish, but most of those tend to be about the website. And some of them are a follow-up about, from Amazon, how was the delivery process? This is more relationship based on an ongoing basis, where you really want to start with the baseline, understand where you are, what they want to hear, and that will guide your how and how you move forward, and your what to some degree as well. But then it also maintains a relationship. It lets folks know that you want to hear from them, that you want this to be two-way rather than one way.
And it sounds like exactly right. If I'm listening and then I reiterate the kind of language that comes from these surveys or conversations, I'm demonstrating to my various audiences that we are listening and we are, in fact, going to take your feedback. So to me, that seems like a very healthy environment for a nonprofit to kind of engage its stakeholders. And that's exactly what you're encouraging them to do.
It is. Sometimes folks are afraid to do that because they'll say, well, I know what they already want, is one thing that I hear. I know what they want. This is what they're unhappy about. And people are often surprised. Yeah, you know some of the things that they're unhappy about. And if you're not addressing those, that's a separate problem. So first off, that's something to consider, but you don't know it all. And then the second piece is not just to that you already know, but it's also just the fact that asking, people appreciate that. People want to be heard, and they don't necessarily expect that you're going to do everything that they say. They don't expect you to be able to do all of it, but if you acknowledge that you heard it and consider, okay, this is how we're incorporating that feedback, or this is why we can't right now, but why we will look to doing this in the the future. People appreciate that more than being ignored. And I'm guessing that's true in our personal relationships as well.
Could not agree more. I think that's something we could emphasize on every front in our lives in terms of acknowledging, well, first listening, being a good listener, and then acknowledging the feedback, even if you can't put it immediately to use. I think you're exactly right, Cheryl, that there will be an appreciation for that exchange. And I want to underline something else you said, which I thought was significant. It's the use sometimes of lots of jargon, acronyms, and I found it not just in the healthcare philanthropy sector, but often that's an area that has complexity, and the staff are used to using the terminology so much that they say it without thinking. But it sounds like, Cheryl, that's something maybe you zero in on when you're working with an organization, and you have to almost check them on, hey, your audiences are not going to know exactly what that means.
Absolutely. When I'm working with an organization right now and developing their communications plan, and they're in arts and culture. So you would think, oh, wow, that's something everybody understands. Everybody
Right,
gets
right.
it. But even with them, they've been surprised how and I'm not always my client's target audience, but in this case, I was like, I don't know what that means. And
Wow.
even the word culture, some people think it implies highbrow, and that's
Right,
a word
right.
that they use every day. So as an example, that's one word they need to think about. Also, as you do your core statement, one exercise that I take folks through in developing that core kind of elevator type statement is say it out loud. Say it to somebody who doesn't work with you every day. Read it out loud. But even as folks in a small group I'm working with now read it out loud, they see the jargon. They hear the jargon. They understand it. But it's also part of what you test in your research. So once you've gotten pretty far along with it, you can test and say, hey, does this seem compelling to you? Does this something you respond to? What's missing? What will we add? And that can be part of your research program as well.
Or they might respond, yeah, I don't know what you mean by that.
Exactly.
It was beautiful, almost poetic on your website or in some of your material, but if someone can't translate it, then obviously you've missed an opportunity to engage. So that's a fascinating exercise, Cheryl, to get them to actually say it out loud, because you're right. I bet a lot of the material we use is recycled. Someone wrote it, several years ago, and they thought it sounded really well, but actually when it's spoken, maybe it doesn't make sense.
That's right. That's right.
Well, it leads to a question, and a lot of the great coaching you do, I know, literally is helping leaders be more effective spokespersons for their organization. And maybe talk about that a little bit, the importance of that public speaking role for a nonprofit leader. And Cheryl, as you and I know, not everybody's comfortable with that. So how do you help someone, be a better public speaker and spokesperson for their nonprofit?
So it really is a mandatory part of the job. It's not optional, unless there are some organizations that kind of have a two-headed structure and there's an outside person and an inside person, and
Right.
maybe you're more of the inside kind of person of that. But typically the outside person is the person at the top. They are both the voice to the world. They, to some degree, as well as beneficiaries, help embody the organization. So one of the things that you need to consider is this is part of my job. It's a critical part of my job, and get comfortable with it. But I think it gets back to practicing, particularly when it comes to media relations. Be prepared with practicing how to answer, what do you do? What's special about what you do, in any sort of opportunity to do so. People are often concerned because of the quote unquote tough questions.
Right.
Prepare for those. So spend a lot of time preparing for those tough questions. And then practice. When I practice with clients, we actually practice on video, even if it's not a real-time video visual opportunity, because seeing yourself is really important. I seldom, if it's up to me, I don't allow a client to do any sort of media relations, which I consider to be kind of the toughest standard. If you
Right.
can do that, you can probably do all of the other ones pretty well. And so we practice. We have a message track that we've developed. We're clear on our why, we're clear on our who, we're clear on our what, and we have it as a tool in front of us for our message track, kind of summarized perhaps on the back of an envelope for an interview. And we really practice the tough questions until it's comfortable. An exercise that I often work with coaching clients and Marcom clients on is, what are the 3 outcomes or actions or messages that you want your audience to hear? What are the 3 most important things? And I work with them until those are clear and succinct. Then, what are the 3 that they want to hear? Because sadly, they aren't always the same thing.
Right,
So
right.
what are the 3 things they're going to want to hear? And then the third part of the exercise I've already discussed is, what do you hope they won't ask? And that's part of the prep, along with the message track, the messaging strategy, to help folks prepare for these opportunities.
All right, a couple questions there, Cheryl. I love that. Of course, I'm terrified too. The video practice, I've got to believe is very helpful, but it also would certainly lift up maybe some of the things I need to work on, right? And if I'm fidgeting or if I'm interrupting the interviewer, or I'm not listening well enough to answer the question, or what are some of the things that show up on video that maybe would help someone be more effective?
So as a coach and as a consultant, I really try and focus on the positive. We're all going to have our personal tics and challenges. They make us human. Don't disproportionately focus on those. Focus on what you're good at. You did this really well. You can build on this, and really not worry so much about those other things, because we're human. For example, a pause seems so much longer to you than it ever does to your listener. And
Good
yet it can
point.
be so helpful in organizing your thoughts. Now, there are some basics, the ums and the ahs and, all of those sorts of things that we kind of need to work on. But in general, I have found that focusing on what works and one's strengths is really the way to achieve success in professional performance, in marketing communications, in strategic planning. Again, unless there's a weakness that is really keeping you that's a real clear and obvious barrier, but that typically isn't the case.
I love the point of taking your time. I have found that to be helpful myself, and I'm glad you reinforce it, because I do think nonprofit leaders feel the pressure sometimes to respond quickly, and they would do themselves such a favor by just collecting their thoughts and practicing. The question I get, Cheryl, and I was going to ask you as well, is kind of the media question, and the response is one. Well, worst case is not responding at all. It's a tough question. I'm not even going to take it. Or the kind of classic no comment. How do you respond to that as a strategy for a leader dealing with the media? Is there an appropriate way to manage that? Or is it in some cases appropriate to say, yeah, just no comment?
I think it gets back to preparation. So it gets back to that question of, what do you hope not to get asked? So ideally, you will be well prepared for those, and you'll have practiced for those situations where you'd want to use a no comment, and you've either proactively addressed the point that they would have asked about, or you have, if you really need to be reactive, you don't want to bring people's attention to it, maybe you'll get lucky and they don't bring it up, but you have your response ready. Even with all that prep, there is sometimes something that'll come up that you're unprepared for. We're human,
Right.
we can't necessarily think of everything, but if that comes up, then take a breath and say, hey, that's a difficult question. I really don't want to answer that lightly. Let me get back to you on that. It's not great, but it's better than kind of no comment or blowing it off. But it really is about the preparation in advance. If there's anything, so say that you didn't know, for example, something horrible with your employee, or it just happened in the news and you didn't know about it. Hey, I am just hearing about this. It's a really sensitive topic, and I won't be able to comment on that right now, but I will get back to you in the next 2 hours with a response to that. And I appreciate you bringing it to my attention.
That's beautiful. And you're right. So much better than the abrupt no comment or the evasive statement that really doesn't do anything any good. And so that is back to your point, though. If you're practiced for that, even if you get the bombshell that's unexpected, you literally, Cheryl, just articulated a good response to a bombshell question, and it at least is respectful and assures the person asking the question, hey, I'll get back to you. And you don't get, you don't stumble into an answer that you'll regret later.
And that takes practice too, to your point, Patton, because we are, as humans, we're smart and we're helpful, and that means we like to give answers. It makes us look smart and it makes us look helpful. So you almost have to practice that holding back and have that prepared to be authentic in how you deliver it. So it's not robotic, but also so that you're prepared to manage the impulse to blurt out a response in the moment.
Cheryl, this has me motivated to think about my professional development. Public speaking, we can always do better. You've got me fired up to try to work on that. And in particular, this media relations element. Every nonprofit leader, either currently or if they hope to be one, needs to be ready. And it strikes me that's the kind of professional development you're such a good advocate for. And I wonder if you could speak even more on that. Why do you encourage nonprofit leaders to focus on professional development, and what kind of ideas do you offer them in that space?
So professional development is so key because it creates a culture that values individual and team development. So one, when you invest in your own, you're role modeling for your team, but you really need to make sure that you're finding ways. And again, it's like marketing. It's a tough thing to find the dollars to invest in. Perhaps you can find a donor, or there's some way to get the support for investing in professional development. I used my budget when I worked for the humanitarian organization, and it wasn't easy, but I carved out money for each of my team members to choose a professional development opportunity for themselves each year. One chose to go to South by Southwest, and let me tell you, I had to bite my tongue on that one. I'm like,
you weren't sure about that idea, were you?
Wasn't sure about that, but I required them to come back with a report and what they learned and how they would apply it, and it invested in loyalty, and they did gain something from it that was really valuable that they shared with the team. So you can't always do that, but that really affects the culture. But it starts with you. It shows vulnerability. I know I'm not perfect. I'm continuing to grow as a leader, and this is something that I want to support our culture and others. One of my clients, Mercy Corps, I don't think they'll mind that I mention that all of their employees are eligible for leadership coaching. I know because I'm on the faculty, and it's a part of their unique benefits package that really sets them apart. And I think that's especially critical now for nonprofits in this current hot market for great talent too. So there's a lot of benefits to it. It helps you show vulnerability, it helps you as a leader, it helps create a good culture, and bottom line, professional development does skill development for your employees.
Yeah, you make each individual better, the whole team gets better. So a multitude of good rationale for professional development. And I definitely want to highlight your idea there about making professional development shared amongst the team. I think a lot of times, me as a nonprofit leader, I might think, well, this is kind of individual. It's almost bonus funding for each individual if I'm going to allow them to do that. But you turned it into a team building exercise. In fact, when I was at Queen's University, that was something we encouraged because we wanted each of our members of the team to find an aspirational peer at another university. But what I was determined to do is I want you to bring back ideas from that peer back to our team meeting. And Cheryl, it sounds like that's exactly what you did. It wasn't like you can go do your professional development retreat or workshop or whatever. You literally had them report back what they got out of that. And I'm sure that helped other people in the room.
Absolutely. So they learned the skills, it was team building, it helped create the culture. Yes, all of those things.
Something else, Cheryl, that you articulated well is I think there's an increasing awareness from our donors and our supporters to invest in our people. And so where we often cut that from the budgeting process, that being, as you said, marketing, professional development. But I'm hoping in this kind of pandemic environment, there's an increased awareness of the mental and physical well-being of our teams. And in fact, some of our greatest donor supporters might invest in professional development, especially if we make a case like you did as to the value of our team and the way it can get even better.
Pat, and that is so smart. And now is the time. Now is a time where you can look for that support, where potential donors who didn't consider it in the past now understand why this is important. So now might be a really excellent time to try and make a case for a specific donor to invest in this sort of culture and skill development for your nonprofit.
Everybody wins there, don't they? And that's, again, why making this case, I'm glad you raised these good ideas, because I want our nonprofit leader listeners to think about professional development, maybe in an even more intentional way, and not do it as just kind of the nice to have element, but frankly, a critical element to your organization's culture. Cheryl, back to the great work you do in terms of marketing and communications. I wonder if there's an even more heightened need for the kind of work you're doing, because organizations obviously are not able to have the live event engagement with many of their stakeholders and constituencies. So have you had to adapt some of your work to organizations that are like, hey, Cheryl, we can't do our annual donor event. We can't do some of those in-person things we have historically done. So how do you help them reshape, I guess, their marketing communication as a result?
It's really been fascinating because it's amazing. We've been in this now almost a year and a half. I mean, when you think about that, it just blows one's mind how long our lives have been changed irrevocably by this pandemic. So a lot of the basic upfront work had to be done within the first year. Everybody has been through a cycle where they missed a gala or a fundraising event or a fun run or a season in the case of arts and culture institutions. Everybody's been through that now. So people have lived through it, and it's been just so cool and amazing to see how some organizations have even benefited from that. It allows you to reach people who may not have been interested in a gala or an event or a formal event, or in the case of theater, it allows you to connect virtually with audiences you haven't in the past. So I think that now you've been through that first year, you've learned a lot. The question is, what next? And like it or not, the future is hybrid. So how do you think about hybrid? How do you do the both and? And it comes back again to your who. What works for them? What will most engage them and compel them? Some of your who, I'm using theaters as an example.
Sure.
Some of you who may not be comfortable coming back into the theater for a very long time. So how do you, even though they can now, they may not want to. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something, I guess is how some people view it. So how do they think about that both and how does that affect how they'll move forward in the world? What I've really been impressed with are organizations that are continuing to invest in marketing communications, found in employee development, in benefits, and really understand that the world has changed and that your strategic plan may need to adjust, and the foundational efforts that you need to put in to build the structure of your nonprofit may need to change as well. So investing, obviously DEI is in diversity, equity, and inclusion is a big example of that. That's something that people have been investing in to varying degrees, varying nonprofits for a while, but this is an opportunity now to think in terms of how do I build that into my plan for today and tomorrow and the future in a way that I might not have considered in the past. So these foundational structural elements, in addition to the services you deliver, I think have never been more important.
And I love how you tied back where we began this conversation, the structure of your 4 steps. And you used it again, the why, who, what, and how, as you ponder new challenges as an organization. Again, the hybrid environment you just described. But I love how you still apply that framework. Before we jump to the what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, we still need to start with the question, why we do what we do, and who are we trying to serve, who are we trying to communicate with. And it seems to me, Cheryl, that's why your framework is so effective.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it works well. And I can't really take full credit for it. I talk about P&G a lot, but it is,
You learned a
um,
lot there, though, didn't you?
I did learn a lot there. It is actually a framework that they used for marketing many, many years ago. I'm sure they've moved on to many others by now that I've adapted for nonprofits.
No, it's well done. And again, it's among many great pieces of advice you've offered our listeners today. And for that, Cheryl, I'm grateful. I've got lots of notes and I'm motivated to reconvene some of my nonprofit friends around their marketing communication, their professional development, their personal public speaking and media relations skills, lots of things to think about. And I guess on that positive note, I wonder, Cheryl, as you talk to folks in the community, maybe not currently nonprofit, but someone comes up to you and says, I'm thinking about getting involved in nonprofit leadership. What is your advice for them?
I ask myself three questions when someone invites me to, or I used to, actually, I've probably slacked off lately and I've been saying yes way too often. So I need to step back on that. But I used to ask myself three questions before I got involved with a new nonprofit. Is this something that I am passionate about? There's just so much going on in our lives, and we really we can give more and we can give better and make more of an impact if this is something that really tugs at our heart. So is this an issue or an opportunity that I have passion for? The second, and these actually aren't in any particular order, is do I have the skills? Can I add value? Is there something that I specifically give that will be helpful, something in my experience that I know this organization can prioritize and benefit from right now? And then the third is, do I have the capacity? Do I have space in my life to do this right now? Or is it a burden? Is it going to feel like a burden, in which case I lose the passion? So those are the three questions I ask myself to make sure that I'm focusing, and they're ones that I offer to clients as well to consider. With that said, I hope that you can find the space, even as a nonprofit leader. Obviously, you're making a huge difference in the world through your organization, but is there somewhere else where you can find passion or balance? If you're doing humanitarian work, maybe there's a sports organization that gets you outside and gets you involved, or
Right.
involved with children. How can you find that balance? So it's not that you aren't already giving, you are, but where else can you find balance and passion in your life and make a difference through another organization and another organization's mission?
Fantastic. Three questions that certainly apply both to a professional journey as well as you put it, volunteer opportunities. Do I have capacity? Do I bring skills and value to the organization? And do I have a passion for it? If I can answer those three questions in the affirmative, then perhaps indeed this is a time to consider nonprofit leadership. So thank you again, Cheryl, for putting that so well into a framework we can consider. If I can ask one parting gift from you, and you knew this was coming amongst all the great feedback you've given our listeners to consider, do you have a book that's been meaningful to you that you recommend to someone maybe on the path to nonprofit leadership?
Wow, best is really hard because there's so many resources out there and they're published every day. And one of the things I've tried to find time for my life for in the past year or two is both pleasure and professional development reading. But one that I'm really a big fan of is Gallup's Strengths Finder. So I talked about focusing on your strengths. Really, what are you good at? Not getting distracted by what you aren't as good at. Our weaknesses are like the poor. They're always going to be with us.
Right.
The Bible says, but
Right.
focusing on your strengths really moves you forward. So I like Gallup's Strengths Finder. I love asking my clients what they think their strengths are. And that's always a fun and valuable conversation. But after that conversation, this book often identifies additional strengths and articulates them in a different way and gives suggestions on how they can be applied and how you can work with others who have complementary strengths that I really appreciate.
Delighted to lift up that book. And again, it certainly reinforces your style, Cheryl. It strikes me as a consultant, as a coach, as someone working with nonprofits, you are going to lift up their strengths and build upon that. So thank you for that and all the things you've shared today. And I guess I'll let you leave our listeners with this. Where can people find out more about you and the great work you're doing through Hudgins Williams Associates?
Well, I'm the cobbler's child that has no shoes, but feel free to visit my website at cghwilliams.com. And I also really hope that your listeners will reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can search under Cheryl Hudgins Williams and add a note sharing anything that resonated with you today from this conversation, which, by the way, was loads of fun. Thank you, Pat McDowell.
Cheryl, you're kind to say that. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we will indeed link up to your LinkedIn, to your website, as well as share the other resources that you and I have discussed during this episode. So for that, thank you again for joining me on the path.
You are so welcome, Patton.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Cheryl as much as I did and came away with some practical ideas that can enhance your organization's strategy, in particular, how it can develop breakthrough marketing and communications. Don't forget the show notes. They are available on our website, pattonmcdowell.com. You can find out more about Cheryl, how to connect with her, and learn more about the great work she's doing through Hudgins Williams Associates. As always, please share this episode with someone else on the path. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe. Go to our new podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com, and you'll see links to all of the primary podcast platforms. Don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday, as well as bonus features we're producing at least once a month. Thanks for all you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now. And keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.